Hey friends, tonight we are going back, and I mean really back, to a time before cities, before writing, before bread, before anyone had ever complained about a delayed coffee order or a slow internet connection. We are going back to a world where the horizon was unbroken, where the night sky was so thick with stars it looked almost solid, and where the only deadline that mattered was finding food before the sun went down. Tonight's journey is about how early humans, people with brains almost identical to yours, survived, adapted, and quietly thrived on a planet that offered absolutely no safety nets, no delivery services, and certainly no customer support lines. Now, here is a gentle reality check before we go any further. If you were dropped, right now, into the world we are about to explore, no phone, no tools, no jacket, no granola bar tucked into your bag, the odds of your survival would be, let's say, diplomatically challenging. Your modern brain is brilliant at spreadsheets and streaming recommendations, but it would take considerable time to catch up to the instincts these early humans had spent hundreds of thousands of years quietly perfecting. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love knowing what corners of the globe are settling in for the night together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine a landscape with nothing built on it. No roads, no fences, no lights on any horizon. The ground beneath your feet is soft in places, rocky in others, and every few miles, the vegetation shifts, from open grassland to dense scrub, to the edge of a dark forest, where something large is almost certainly watching you from the shadows. The air smells clean in a way that modern air simply does not anymore. There is wood smoke somewhere distant, and beneath that, the damp mineral scent of a nearby river. This is roughly 100,000 years ago. Anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, your direct ancestors, have existed for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years by this point, depending on which fossil site and which research team you consult. And already, without a single city, without a single written law, without a single agreed-upon currency, they have spread into an enormous range of environments. They are living in the grasslands of East Africa, along coastlines, beside rivers, and beginning, slowly, to push into territories that would once have seemed completely uninhabitable. But here is the thing that tends to get lost in popular imagination. These were not confused, stumbling creatures fumbling through a hostile world. They were sophisticated, deeply, quietly sophisticated. Their brains were not practice runs for your brain. They were, in almost every measurable way, equivalent to it. The same capacity for language, planning, memory, creativity, and emotional complexity that you use to navigate modern life was fully operational in these people. They just pointed those abilities at an entirely different set of problems, and the problems were considerable. There was no agriculture yet, which means no stored food supply, no predictable harvest, no grain sitting safely in a barn. There were no domesticated animals providing reliable protein. There were no antibiotics waiting in a cabinet. There were no walls between the people sleeping and the predators moving through the dark. The Pleistocene epoch, the geological period stretching roughly from 2.6 million years ago to about 11,700 years ago, was a world shared with megafauna that modern humans have simply never had to face. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears the size of small cars, giant ground sloths that would have towered over most modern trucks, and saber-toothed cats with canine teeth the length of your hand, moving silently through long grass. And yet, humanity not only survived this world, it flourished in it. Scientists still debate exactly when the cognitive revolution, that critical spark of symbolic thinking, complex language, and advanced planning, truly ignited in the human lineage. Some researchers place it around 70,000 years ago, pointing to a sudden flowering of tool complexity and personal ornamentation in the archaeological record. Others argue that the evidence suggests a much more gradual accumulation of these traits stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, with no single dramatic moment of awakening. The debate matters because it shapes how we understand the humans we are going to be spending the rest of tonight's journey with. What we do know is that survival in this world was never a solo achievement. It was a collective, deeply social, endlessly creative project. Every day was a negotiation between the human body, the human mind, the group those humans belonged to, and the wild, indifferent, occasionally breathtaking world they all moved through together. Tonight, we are going to wander through that world, one section at a time. We will look at what they ate, how they dressed, where they slept, how they healed their wounds, how they understood the sky above them, and how they found meaning in a life that contained almost no material comfort by modern standards, but was, by many measures, extraordinarily rich. So settle in, pull the blanket up a little. The fire is low, the wind outside is soft, and we have a very long, very quiet, very interesting night ahead of us. Before we talk about what early humans did to survive, it helps to spend a little time appreciating the machine they were doing it in. Because the human body, when you strip away all the modern comforts it has been quietly spoiled by, is a genuinely remarkable piece of biological engineering. It is not the fastest animal on the savannah. It is not the strongest. It cannot fly. It cannot breathe underwater. And its claws are, frankly, embarrassing. But what it can do, what it was shaped by millions of years of evolution to do, is something almost no other animal on Earth can match. Let's start with something you probably do every day without thinking about it. Walking, or more specifically, walking for an extremely long time without stopping. Early humans were persistence hunters, a strategy so elegantly brutal that it sounds almost unsportsmanlike when you first hear it. The idea is simple. You find an animal, a deer, an antelope, a wildebeest, and you follow it. Not sprint after it, follow it, at a steady, unhurried, relentless pace for hours, sometimes most of a day. The animal, being a four-legged creature, covered in fur, with no ability to sweat efficiently, eventually overheats. It cannot pant fast enough to shed the heat building in its muscles. And when it finally slows, when it stumbles, when it simply cannot run anymore, you are still there, still walking, barely winded, closing the gap. This works because of a small but extraordinary biological fact. Humans are among the best long-distance runners and walkers on the planet. The Achilles tendon stores and releases elastic energy with each stride. The gluteus maximus, your largest muscle, the one you are probably resting on right now, stabilizes the torso during running in a way unique to upright bipeds. And crucially, the human body cools itself through sweating across an enormous surface area of skin, a system so efficient that in hot, open environments, a healthy human can quite literally outlast almost any four-legged animal alive. But the story gets more interesting when you look at what else the body was doing during those long days of movement. Early human groups covering large territories on foot were also, without any conscious awareness of this, building extraordinary internal maps. The hippocampus, the brain region associated with spatial memory and navigation, was being exercised constantly, logging landmarks, water sources, seasonal grazing patterns, and the subtle shifts in vegetation that signal a change in terrain. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer communities, which offer our closest living window into prehistoric lifeways, consistently find navigational abilities that would strike most modern urbanites as almost supernatural. People who can return unerringly to a water source visited once, 2 years prior, across 50 miles of apparently featureless landscape. Here is where things get a little surprising, though. The early human body, for all its endurance brilliance, was dealing with a level of physical stress that would be considered extreme by modern medical standards. Bone analysis from Pleistocene era human remains shows evidence of healed fractures, chronic joint stress, muscle attachment markers indicating enormous upper body strength from a lifetime of heavy physical labor, and dental wear patterns suggesting a diet that required serious chewing effort on a daily basis. These were not fragile people, but they were people living in bodies pushed hard every single day, from childhood onward. Interestingly, researchers have not fully agreed on whether the physical robustness of early Homo sapiens, the heavier brow ridges, the denser bones, the more muscular builds seen in earlier populations, gradually reduced over time because of cultural and technological changes that took some of that physical burden off the body, or whether other evolutionary pressures were at work. What the fossil record does seem to suggest is that as tool technology improved and social cooperation became more sophisticated, the raw physical demands on individual bodies may have shifted in subtle ways over tens of thousands of years. And then there is the brain itself, which burns an almost scandalous proportion of the body's total energy, roughly 20% of all calories consumed, despite accounting for only about 2% of body weight. This is an expensive organ to run, and in a world without guaranteed meals, that energy cost mattered enormously. Some researchers argue that the shift toward eating more calorie-dense animal protein, meat, marrow, fat, was not just a dietary preference, but an evolutionary necessity driven partly by the metabolic demands of a rapidly expanding brain. You needed good food to think clearly, and you needed to think clearly to get good food. A tidy, slightly circular arrangement that natural selection apparently found very appealing. Something else the human body was doing remarkably well in this period was something we rarely credit as a survival skill: sleeping. Early humans, like all humans, required sleep to consolidate memory, regulate emotion, repair tissue, and maintain immune function. But the where and how of prehistoric sleep was considerably more complex than pulling a duvet over your head. Sleep locations had to be chosen carefully, elevated enough to reduce predator risk, sheltered enough to retain warmth, close enough to water and resources to make early movement practical. Some evidence suggests early humans may have slept in trees in earlier periods, as our closest primate relatives still do, before ground sleeping became more common. As fire use expanded, the body, in other words, was not just a vehicle for survival. It was an active, adaptive, continuously recalibrating system, shaped over millions of years to handle exactly the kind of world it found itself in. Not perfectly, not without pain or injury or illness, but with a quiet, deep competence that deserves considerably more admiration than we typically give it. You're carrying that same body right now, lying there in the dark, a little softer around the edges than your Pleistocene predecessors, perhaps a little less accustomed to walking 8 hours through open grassland. But underneath all the modern comfort, the same ancient engineering is still humming along, doing exactly what it was always built to do. Imagine stepping outside tonight with no phone, no map, no compass, and no idea which direction the nearest town lies. For most people in the modern world, that scenario produces a low but genuine hum of anxiety almost immediately. We are accustomed to being located, to knowing precisely where we are in relation to everything else, with a small glowing screen confirming our position every few seconds. Strip that away, and the world suddenly feels very large and very quiet in a way that is more unsettling than peaceful. Now imagine that instead of panic, you feel something closer to calm attentiveness, because the world around you is not silent or empty of information. It is absolutely saturated with it. The angle of the light tells you the time of day with reasonable precision. The direction the wind is coming from tells you something about incoming weather. The behavior of the birds in the trees ahead tells you whether a large animal has passed through recently. The condition of the soil tells you how long ago it rained. The specific combination of plant species growing in a particular patch tells you something about what kind of water drainage exists beneath your feet, which in turn tells you where to look for a spring. The world, in other words, is covered in text. You just have to learn to read it. This is what early human perception actually looked like. Not the blunt, distracted awareness of someone half watching their surroundings while mentally composing a reply to an email, but a deep, layered, continuously updated reading of the environment that processed information at a speed and resolution that most modern humans have simply never needed to develop. And this was not a special skill belonging to a gifted few. It was ordinary. It was the baseline competence expected of every adult member of a group, because the consequences of missing a critical environmental signal were not inconvenience. They were injury, starvation, or death. Animal tracking is perhaps the most well-documented example of this environmental literacy, and it is worth spending a moment genuinely appreciating how extraordinary it is. A skilled tracker, reading a set of prints in soft earth, is performing an act of inference that rivals anything a detective does in a procedural drama. The depth of the print tells you the animal's weight. The spacing tells you its gait and speed. The way the soil has displaced tells you the direction of travel. Slight asymmetries in the print tell you about the animal's posture and health. The presence of moisture in the impression, compared to the surrounding dry soil, tells you roughly how long ago it passed. Combine all of that with knowledge of the animal's behavioral patterns, preferred routes, feeding habits, and likely response to current weather conditions, and you are building a picture so detailed it borders on prediction. Researchers studying modern tracking communities in southern Africa have documented trackers reconstructing entire behavioral sequences from physical evidence, describing not just where an animal went, but what it was doing, how it was feeling, and where it was likely to be now, with an accuracy that initially puzzled scientists trained in more formal methodologies. The cognitive demands of tracking at this level engage spatial reasoning, memory, probabilistic thinking, and narrative construction simultaneously. It is, by most meaningful measures, an act of sophisticated intelligence, but tracking was only one component of environmental reading. Plant knowledge was equally critical, and in many ways more constantly relevant to daily survival. Early humans operating in any given territory would have carried detailed working knowledge of hundreds of plant species, which were edible, which were toxic, which had medicinal properties, which indicated the proximity of water, which were palatable only after specific preparation, and which changed their character dramatically across seasons. This knowledge was not written anywhere. It lived entirely in human memory, passed from generation to generation through demonstration, storytelling, and direct experience. Scientists still debate the extent to which early Homo sapiens used symbolic or proto-linguistic systems to encode and transmit complex environmental knowledge before fully developed spoken language became widespread. Some researchers point to the extraordinary consistency of certain tool-making traditions across vast geographic distances and long time periods as evidence of highly structured knowledge transmission. Others argue that much of this consistency could arise from groups independently arriving at similar solutions to similar problems without requiring sophisticated communication systems. The answer matters because it shapes how we understand the interior life of these early people. Whether they were narrating their world to each other in recognizable ways or operating through systems of knowledge transfer, we have not yet fully learned to interpret. What is not debated is the result. Early humans navigated, hunted, gathered, and survived across an enormous range of environments with a precision that required intimate, detailed, continuously updated knowledge of their surroundings. They knew their territory the way you know your own home, where the creaky floorboard is, where the light switch sits in total darkness, which door sticks in humid weather. Except their home was sometimes several hundred square miles of wild landscape, and the consequences of a wrong step were considerably more serious than a stubbed toe. There is something quietly humbling about sitting with that image for a moment. The idea that intelligence, in its earliest and most essential human form, looked like this, not numbers on a screen, not abstract symbols on a page, but a living, breathing, constantly renewed conversation between a human mind and the physical world surrounding it. A conversation conducted without words, across a landscape that had no roads, no markers, no infrastructure of any kind, just the land, the light, the wind, and a mind perfectly shaped to read all three. The truly remarkable part comes when you consider how much of that reading ability still lives inside you, dormant and patient, waiting for a world that no longer needs it quite so urgently. There is a moment, sitting beside a campfire on a quiet night, when something very old stirs in the human nervous system. The pull toward flame is not merely aesthetic or practical. It is ancient in a way that bypasses conscious thought entirely. Watching fire, most people find their breathing slows a little, their shoulders drop, their eyes soften into a particular kind of unfocused attention that is neither fully awake nor asleep, but somewhere gently between the two. Researchers who have studied the physiological effects of firelight on the human body have found measurable reductions in blood pressure associated with fire watching in relaxed social settings, which is a very scientific way of saying what every camper already knows. There is something about fire that feels, on a very deep level, like coming home. That feeling makes complete sense when you consider how long fire has been part of the human story. The earliest convincing evidence of controlled fire use by human ancestors dates to roughly 1 million years ago, at a site called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where burned bone and plant ash suggest that Homo erectus, our evolutionary predecessor, was already managing fire in some capacity. By the time anatomically modern humans arrived on the scene, fire was not a new discovery. It was an inherited relationship, already ancient, already woven into the fabric of daily life. in ways that had been quietly reshaping human biology and behavior for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. But what did fire actually change? The obvious answers come first. Warmth, obviously, critical in a world that could swing between blazing savanna heat and the bone-deep cold of glacial periods within a single human lifetime, depending on geography and climate shifts. Light, equally obviously, the ability to extend the usable hours of the day beyond sunset, to push back the dark that belonged, before fire, entirely to the nocturnal predators moving through it. Protection, certainly. A ring of firelight created a psychological and physical boundary between the sleeping group and whatever was circling in the shadows beyond it. And most large predators maintained a respectful distance from open flame. But the less obvious answers are where things get genuinely fascinating. Consider cooking. The controlled application of heat to food transforms it in ways that go far beyond making it more palatable. Cooking breaks down plant cell walls, releasing nutrients that would otherwise pass through the digestive system, largely unused. It denatures proteins in meat, making them easier and faster to digest. It kills pathogens, and critically, it dramatically reduces the time and energy the body must spend on digestion itself. Raw food requires enormous digestive effort. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, spend a significant portion of their day simply chewing. Cooking essentially pre-processes food outside the body, freeing up metabolic energy that can be redirected elsewhere. The biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham developed an influential hypothesis, arguing that cooking was not merely a useful tool adopted by already modern humans, but a driving force in human evolution itself. That the shift to cooked food allowed the reduction of the large, energy-expensive gut seen in earlier hominins, while simultaneously providing the caloric surplus needed to fuel a larger, more metabolically demanding brain. It is a genuinely elegant argument, and while it remains actively debated among researchers, some of whom argue the timeline of consistent cooking use does not fully support such a central evolutionary role, it has shifted how many scientists think about the relationship between fire, food, and the human mind. And then there is the social dimension of fire, which may ultimately be its most profound legacy. A fire at the center of a group creates something that did not exist before it, a shared focal point, a reason to gather, a space defined by warmth and light that naturally encourages proximity and interaction. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer communities have noted that the content of conversation shifts meaningfully between daytime and fire-lit evening hours. Daytime talk tends toward the practical: food, tools, movement, logistics. Evening fire talk trends toward the social and the imaginative: stories, memories, relationships, speculation about the world. Some researchers have suggested that the campfire evening may have been one of the primary contexts in which early human narrative and storytelling developed, with the relaxed, socially bonded atmosphere of the fire circle providing both the occasion and the audience for the kind of extended, imaginative communication that no other great ape engages in. Scientists still debate precisely when habitual, reliable fire-making, as opposed to the opportunistic capture and maintenance of naturally occurring fire from lightning strikes or volcanic sources, became widespread in the human lineage. The distinction matters enormously. Maintaining a fire you found is a valuable skill. Making fire from scratch, whenever and wherever you need it, is a transformative one. Evidence for consistent fire-making technology, including the use of pyrite and flint for spark generation or friction-based methods using wooden tools, becomes clearer in the archaeological record. somewhere between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago. Though some sites suggest earlier capability, the exact timeline remains a subject of genuine scientific conversation. What is not in dispute is the effect. Fire changed the night. It pushed the darkness back to a distance, where it became backdrop rather than threat. It gathered people together in circles of shared warmth and shared light. It cooked the food that fed the brain, that told the stories that were shared around the fire, that gathered the people together. A loop so tight and so self-reinforcing that it is almost impossible to say where it begins. Tonight, if you have a lamp on somewhere nearby, dimmed low and warm, you are participating in a version of that same ancient loop. The light is electric rather than wood-fed, but the effect on your nervous system is not entirely different. Something old recognizes it. Something old relaxes. There is a persistent romantic image of the prehistoric hunter, lean, focused, silhouetted against a dramatic sky, spear raised against some magnificent beast. It is a compelling picture, and it is not entirely wrong. But if you had followed an actual early human group through a typical week of foraging and food acquisition, the reality would have been considerably more varied, considerably more opportunistic, and occasionally considerably more unglamorous than that image suggests. A significant portion of prehistoric caloric intake came not from dramatic hunts, but from things like digging. A lot of digging. Underground tubers, roots, and bulbs were calorie-dense, reliably present across seasons when surface foods were scarce, and required no hunting strategy beyond locating them and extracting them from the earth with a pointed stick, which is not to diminish the achievement. Finding edible roots in unfamiliar terrain, distinguishing them reliably from toxic lookalikes, knowing which preparation they required, and which could be eaten raw. This was skilled, knowledge-intensive work. Just perhaps not the stuff of Hollywood epics. The actual diet of early Homo sapiens was what nutritionists today would call extraordinarily diverse. Across different populations and different environments, it included meat from large game animals, small mammals, birds and their eggs, fish and shellfish where available, insects and their larvae, honey, a prized and energetically significant food when accessible, along with fruits, berries, nuts, seeds, leaves, tubers, roots, fungi, and a rotating seasonal cast of whatever the local landscape happened to be offering at any given time. This variety was not merely preference, it was survival strategy. Dependence on any single food source in a world without storage or agriculture was a vulnerability. Breadth of diet was insurance. The pursuit of honey is worth a particular moment of appreciation because it illustrates something important about prehistoric risk calculation. Wild bee colonies in a large tree or rock crevice represented an enormous caloric prize. Honey is pure sugar energy, and bee larvae are rich in protein and fat. Accessing that prize meant enduring stings, sometimes in considerable numbers, while climbing to the colony and extracting the comb. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests this was considered entirely worth it. Several modern hunter-gatherer groups maintain honey-gathering traditions of remarkable sophistication, including cooperative relationships with a bird called the honey guide, which leads humans to bee colonies in exchange for access to the wax and larvae left behind. The relationship is so established that both species appear to have evolved communicative signals specific to it. Occasionally, nature arranges things that are almost impossibly charming, but things are about to get considerably stranger when we look at the large game side of the equation. Because hunting megafauna, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant bison, horses, and other large herbivores of the Pleistocene was not simply a matter of courage and a sharp point on a stick. It was a complex, planned, socially coordinated undertaking that required advanced knowledge of animal behavior, terrain, seasonal movement patterns, and group communication, sophisticated enough to execute a coordinated strategy across multiple hunters moving through broken terrain without modern signaling equipment. Evidence from archaeological sites across Europe and Asia suggests that early humans sometimes drove large animals toward natural obstacles, cliff edges, river crossings, boggy ground, where the animal's size and momentum became liabilities rather than assets. The famous mammoth kill sites of the Eurasian steppe show accumulations of bones that imply repeated, systematic hunting of these animals at particular locations over extended time periods, suggesting not random opportunism, but deliberate, knowledge-based targeting of predictable animal behavior. Someone knew where the mammoths would be. Someone remembered from last season, or the season before. That knowledge was worth carrying, worth sharing, worth teaching to the next generation. Interestingly, researchers have not fully agreed on the relative proportion of plant versus animal foods in the diet of Pleistocene Homo sapiens across different populations and environments. Stable isotope analysis of ancient bones can reveal dietary signatures, and results vary considerably by region and time period. Some populations appear to have been heavily meat-dependent, particularly in Arctic and subarctic environments, where plant foods were seasonally unavailable. Others show isotopic signatures, suggesting a much more balanced plant and animal diet. The ongoing debate has practical relevance beyond archaeology, as it feeds directly into modern discussions about ancestral human nutrition and what contemporary humans are biologically optimized to eat. A conversation that generates more heat than almost any other topic in nutritional science. Seasonal variation in diet deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of prehistoric life. The rhythms of food availability shaped the entire structure of the year. Spring might bring fresh plant growth, bird eggs, and the return of migratory animals. Summer offered abundant fruits, insects, and peak hunting conditions. Autumn was the critical time for accumulating fat reserves in people as well as animals. Before the lean months of winter reduced available food to cached supplies, whatever hunting was possible in cold conditions, and the nutritional knowledge to identify and process foods that summer abundance made easy to overlook. Winter was hard, not catastrophically, not for people who knew what they were doing, but genuinely, physically hard in a way that left marks on the body, and yet those bodies kept going, kept moving, kept foraging, kept feeding children and elders and injured group members, kept finding food in landscapes that offered it reluctantly and unpredictably, with a persistence and ingenuity that quietly defies the old notion of prehistoric life as a desperate, hand-to-mouth scramble. It was demanding. It was skillful. It was, by the evidence available to us, surprisingly successful, though it did involve quite a lot of digging. Even the mammoths couldn't change that. If you were to design a shelter from scratch tonight, no hardware store, no lumber yard, no concrete, no glass, using only what the landscape around you could provide, the first thing you would probably discover is that the problem is considerably more complex than it initially appears. It is not simply a matter of stacking things together until the wind cannot get through. A functional shelter must address warmth, moisture, ventilation, structural stability, and the specific threats present in your local environment, all simultaneously. using materials that have their own properties, limitations, and behaviors that must be understood before they can be usefully employed. Most modern people, if honest with themselves, would produce something that generously could be described as optimistic. Early humans, by contrast, had spent generations accumulating exactly the knowledge needed to solve this problem elegantly, repeatedly, and in an extraordinary range of environmental conditions. The shelters they built varied enormously by region, climate, available materials, and the length of time a group intended to stay in a particular location, and they ranged from the impressively simple to the genuinely remarkable. At the simpler end, temporary shelters erected during short hunting forays or seasonal movements might be little more than a framework of branches bent into a dome shape, covered with large leaves, bark, or animal hides, and weighted at the base with stones or packed earth, built by a small group of experienced hands. Such a structure could be erected in a matter of hours, functional, weatherproof enough for the season, and deliberately designed to be abandoned without significant loss when the group moved on. The archaeological signature of these structures is often so faint that finding convincing evidence of them requires exceptional preservation conditions, which is part of why our picture of early human shelter is incomplete in ways that frustrate researchers considerably. But at the more elaborate end of the spectrum, the evidence becomes impossible to dismiss. At sites across Eastern Europe and the Russian plain, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of structures built from mammoth bones, specifically the large curved tusks and heavy limb bones and jaw bones of woolly mammoths, assembled into frameworks that supported hide coverings capable of insulating against the brutal cold of the Pleistocene steppe. These were not improvised windbreaks. They were engineered structures, some of them large enough to accommodate multiple family groups, requiring the collection and transport of enormous quantities of heavy bone material and the coordinated effort of many people working toward a shared architectural vision. Some of the bone arrangements show evidence of careful planning, with specific bone types used for specific structural roles, suggesting a design tradition, a knowledge of how to build this kind of structure that was taught, refined, and passed down across generations. The most famous of these sites, at Mezherik, in present-day Ukraine, contains the remains of 4 mammoth bone structures dating to roughly 15,000 years ago, with one structure incorporating the bones of approximately 95 individual mammoths. 95 mammoths. The logistical implications of that number are worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Whether those bones were collected from natural death sites accumulated over time, or represent the remains of hunted animals, or some combination of both, the organizational effort involved in gathering, transporting, and constructing with that quantity of material was considerable by any measure. Scientists still debate the full range of functions these more elaborate structures served. Beyond the obvious practical shelter role, some researchers have pointed to evidence of ritual or social significance in the arrangement of certain bone structures, hearth placements, specific bone orientations, associated objects, suggesting that the built environment of early humans was not purely utilitarian, but carried social and possibly symbolic meaning. The way the layout and decoration of your own home reflects things about your identity and values that go well beyond simple functionality. Caves, of course, feature prominently in any discussion of prehistoric shelter, and they deserve a brief but important clarification. Early humans did use caves, and cave sites have provided some of the most spectacular archaeological evidence of prehistoric life. precisely because the conditions inside them preserve organic material far better than open-air sites. But caves were not the universal default home of prehistoric people. They were used opportunistically, seasonally, and often for specific purposes, as sheltered campsites during particular seasons, as locations for specific activities, including art making, as places of burial. The image of all prehistoric humans living permanently in caves is a simplification born largely from the fact that cave sites preserve better and are therefore disproportionately represented in the archaeological record. The construction of any shelter also required tools, and the stone tools of the Paleolithic period were considerably more sophisticated than the term stone tool might suggest to a modern ear. Prepared core knapping techniques allowed early humans to produce thin, sharp-edged flakes of flint or obsidian with a degree of control and precision that required years of practice to master. These were not rocks bashed together until something sharp resulted. They were the product of a technical tradition, with its own accumulated knowledge, its own teaching lineage, its own aesthetic standards. Yes, aesthetic standards. Because tool makers apparently cared about the quality and symmetry of their work, beyond the purely functional minimum, which brings us back to the shelters themselves, and the image worth carrying into the next part of tonight's journey. Somewhere on the Eurasian steppe, 15,000 years ago, a family group settles into a structure built from the bones of enormous animals, covered in sewn hides, warmed by a central hearth, protected from a wind that outside is moving at speed across open, frozen ground. Inside it is smoky, close, warm, and lit by the soft orange light of burning fat. Children are asleep in the back. Someone is working on a tool near the fire. The structure around them was built by their own hands, from materials their own knowledge identified and gathered. It is not a bad place to be, all things considered. There is a thought experiment that occasionally surfaces in survival discussions, and it goes something like this. If you were stranded alone in a wilderness environment with no tools and no supplies, how long could you realistically survive? The honest answer for most people is not encouraging. A few days without water, a few weeks without food, assuming you could find it. Considerably less than that if the temperature drops significantly or a predator takes an interest in you. The individual human, stripped of all the accumulated infrastructure of civilization, is genuinely not a very formidable survival unit. We are medium-sized, moderately fast, not particularly strong relative to our body weight, with no natural armor, no venom, no camouflage, and a thermal regulation system that works beautifully in warm conditions, but becomes a serious liability when wet and cold. But that framing misses something fundamental, because the individual human was never the unit of survival that evolution was actually optimizing. The group was. And when you look at what a well-functioning early human group could accomplish together, the picture changes entirely. The basic social unit of Paleolithic human life was what anthropologists call the band, a relatively small fluid group typically ranging from around 20 to 50 individuals, though the size varied considerably based on environment, season, and available resources. The band was not merely a collection of people who happened to be in the same place. It was a finely tuned, cooperative system in which different individuals contributed different skills, knowledge, and capacities, and in which the survival of each member was genuinely dependent on the functioning of the whole. This is not a metaphor or a philosophical observation. It is a literal, practical, daily reality. The injured hunter, who could not move fast enough to hunt, was fed by the group while he healed. The elderly woman, who could no longer cover long distances, contributed knowledge, childcare, and food processing that freed younger group members for more physically demanding tasks. The child who was still years away from being able to contribute meaningfully to food acquisition was fed, protected, and educated by adults who received no immediate return on that investment. This is, when you think about it carefully, an extraordinary arrangement. Most animal social groups operate on much tighter, immediate reciprocity. The sustained, multi-generational investment in non-productive members, the very young, the very old, the injured, the temporarily incapacitated, that characterizes human bands, is unusual in the animal kingdom and represents a level of social trust and long-term thinking that required sophisticated cognitive and emotional machinery to maintain. The grandmother hypothesis is one of the more elegant ideas in human evolutionary theory, and it speaks directly to this point. Proposed most prominently by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, the hypothesis suggests that the extended post-reproductive lifespan of human females, unique or nearly so among primates, evolved because grandmothers who remained healthy and active after their own reproductive years were able to significantly improve the survival odds of their grandchildren by providing food, knowledge, and caregiving support. In other words, grandmothers were so valuable to group survival that natural selection favored living longer after menopause, which is itself a trait almost unparalleled among other mammals. Scientists still debate the relative strength of the grandmother effect compared to other explanations for human longevity, but the core observation that older, post-reproductive females in hunter-gatherer groups contribute enormously to group food acquisition and child survival is well supported by field research. What held these bands together was not just shared need, but something considerably warmer and more complex: friendship, obligation, shared history, the specific texture of relationships built over years of daily proximity, shared difficulty, and mutual dependence. Early human groups were not anonymous collections of strangers pooling resources for efficiency. They were people who knew each other with the deep, granular intimacy that comes from never being very far apart for very long. They knew each other's strengths and limitations, moods and habits, fears and capabilities. They had histories together, remembered hunts, survived hardships, shared losses, shared celebrations. That relational knowledge was itself a resource, because knowing exactly who in your group you could rely on for what, in which situation, and under which conditions, made the group dramatically more effective than it would be if composed of strangers of equivalent individual skill. Conflict within these groups was inevitable, and managing it was a constant, low-level social project. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups consistently describe a strong cultural emphasis on egalitarianism, active, practiced resistance to any individual accumulating disproportionate power, status, or resources at the expense of others. This took the form of social pressure, humor, ostracism, and in persistent cases, more serious consequences. The sharing of food, in particular, appears to have been governed by strong social norms in most studied groups, with successful hunters expected to distribute meat widely rather than prioritizing their immediate family, a practice that simultaneously reinforced social bonds, distributed nutritional benefit across the group, and functioned as a kind of insurance system. Today, I share my surplus with you, and when my hunt fails next week, you share yours with me. Unfortunately, the social web was not infinitely elastic. Groups grew too large, resources became contested, and relations between neighboring bands ranged from cooperative to tense to occasionally violent. Evidence for interpersonal violence in the Paleolithic record is present, though its frequency and character are actively debated. Some researchers see evidence of relatively high rates of conflict between groups. Others argue that the archaeological record reflects selective preservation that overrepresents violent deaths, and that most intergroup relations involved far more exchange and cooperation than conflict. What is clear is that the social web, the dense, complex, emotionally rich network of relationships within and between human groups, was not a luxury added on top of survival. It was the mechanism of survival itself. The cleverest individual mind, the strongest individual body, the most skilled individual tracker meant relatively little without the group surrounding it, sustaining it, and amplifying everything it could do. You already knew this, of course. You just may not have known how ancient that knowledge is. There is a specific quality of alertness that wildlife researchers describe when they spend extended time in environments containing large predators. It is not panic, and it is not paralysis. It is something closer to a permanent, low-level expansion of awareness, a continuous peripheral scanning that becomes so habitual it eventually feels like a natural state rather than an effort. People who have spent time in lion country, in Africa, or in areas with significant bear populations in North America often describe how quickly this alertness becomes automatic, how the nervous system recalibrates to the new baseline of the environment, and how strangely flat and understimulating ordinary safe environments feel afterward by comparison. Your senses, it turns out, have considerably more range than modern life typically asks them to use. For early humans moving through the landscapes of the Pleistocene, that expanded alertness was not a temporary adjustment. It was the permanent, inherited, lifelong condition of existing in a world that contained an array of large, capable predators that regarded humans as a potential food source rather than a dominant species to be respected and avoided. And the roster of those predators was, by any modern standard, genuinely impressive. The cave lion, Panthera spelaea, was larger than any lion alive today, with estimates suggesting some individuals approach the size of a modern male polar bear. It ranged across Europe and northern Asia and appears in Paleolithic cave art with enough frequency and detail to suggest it occupied significant mental space in the imagination of the people sharing its range. The cave hyena, similarly outsized compared to its modern relatives, was an effective predator as well as a scavenger, and would have competed directly with human groups for carcasses and den sites. In southern Asia and Africa, leopards and lions of more familiar dimensions were nonetheless formidable presences in environments where early humans were doing much of their foraging and hunting. And then there were the saber-toothed cats. Smilodon, the most famous genus, is often depicted as a solitary ambush predator, and while the details of its hunting behavior remain subjects of active research, the physical reality of it is not in dispute. The elongated upper canines, reaching up to 28 centimeters in some specimens, were not biting weapons in the conventional sense, but specialized killing tools used to deliver precise, deep wounds to prey that had been immobilized by powerful forelimbs built for grappling rather than sustained pursuit. Smilodon itself was primarily a South American species, but related saber-toothed felids were present in the Old World environments where early humans spent most of their evolutionary history. Sharing a landscape with one of these animals would have required a very specific combination of caution, knowledge, and collective vigilance. But here is where things get interestingly complicated, because early humans were not simply prey in this equation. They were simultaneously prey, competitor, and increasingly the most consequential predator in every environment they entered. The archaeological evidence for human hunting of large animals is extensive and spans an enormous geographic range, and the fossil record of megafauna shows a troubling pattern that follows human arrival across multiple continents with a consistency that is difficult to explain away. As human populations expanded into new territories, Australia, the Americas, various island systems, the large animals of those territories began disappearing with a rapidity that the geological record makes starkly visible. Scientists still debate the precise relative contributions of human hunting pressure versus climate change in driving Pleistocene megafauna extinctions. The climate of the late Pleistocene was genuinely turbulent, with significant shifts in temperature, vegetation, and precipitation that would have stressed animal populations independently of any human activity. Some researchers argue that climate alone can explain most of the extinctions. Others point to the suspicious geographic correlation between human arrival and megafauna collapse, particularly in regions like Australia and the Americas, where the timing of human colonization can be established with reasonable confidence, as evidence that hunting pressure was the primary driver, at least in those cases. The debate is genuinely unresolved and generates significant passion among the researchers engaged in it. What is clear is that early humans developed sophisticated, multi-layered strategies for navigating a world in which they occupied both sides of the predator-prey relationship simultaneously. Avoiding large predators required knowledge of their behavioral patterns, preferred habitats, hunting methods, and activity rhythms. Cave lions, for example, appear to have been largely crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk, which would have shaped human activity scheduling in areas where they were present. Hyenas were more nocturnal, which reinforced the importance of fire and elevated sleeping locations after dark. Knowing these patterns was not academic knowledge. It was operational, daily, life-relevant information. Traveling in groups provided obvious safety benefits. Multiple sets of eyes scanning in multiple directions. The ability to make noise and appear larger and more threatening than a lone individual. And the practical reality that a predator assessing a group of alert, fire-carrying, tool-bearing humans faced a much more complicated risk calculation than it did with a lone ungulate. There is ethnographic evidence from modern hunter-gatherer groups of coordinated responses to predator encounters, specific calls, specific formations, specific behaviors designed to discourage rather than escalate. These responses have the quality of practiced, transmitted knowledge rather than improvised panic, and yet the relationship between early humans and the great predators of their world was not purely adversarial. Cave art depicting lions, hyenas, and bears with extraordinary anatomical precision and evident observational care suggests something that might cautiously be called fascination, a sustained, detailed attention to these animals that went beyond tactical threat assessment into something closer to genuine, wondering interest. They studied their predators. They painted them. They apparently thought about them considerably, which is, when you consider it quietly in the dark, a very human response to something terrifying and magnificent. Not just fear, never just fear. Fear and something very much like awe. At some point during the last ice age, On a cold plain somewhere in Eurasia, a person sat down with a stone scraper, a fresh animal hide, and a significant amount of patience, and began the long process of turning a raw skin into something wearable. This was not a casual afternoon project. Preparing a hide for use as clothing, removing the fat and membrane from the inner surface, working the skin repeatedly to break down the stiff collagen fibers, treating it to prevent rot and maintain flexibility, was skilled, time-consuming labor that could take days of sustained effort for a single large hide, and it had to be done correctly, because incorrectly prepared, hide becomes rigid, cracks, grows mold, and smells in ways that even a Pleistocene human with considerably more tolerance for ambient odor than a modern one would find objectionable. The question of when humans first began wearing clothing is one of those deceptively simple questions that turns out to be remarkably difficult to answer with precision, because clothing made from organic materials, hide, plant fiber, fur, decays almost completely under most preservation conditions, leaving little direct evidence in the archaeological record. We cannot simply dig up a prehistoric jacket and read the date off the label. Instead, researchers have to work with indirect evidence, some of which is surprisingly creative. One of the more elegant indirect approaches involves lice, specifically the evolutionary divergence between head lice and body lice. Head lice live in hair. Body lice live in clothing, specifically in the seams of clothing where they can lay eggs. Since body lice require clothing to exist as a distinct ecological niche, the moment body lice diverged from head lice as a separate subspecies should correspond roughly to the moment humans began wearing clothing regularly enough for that niche to become stable and heritable. Genetic analysis of lice divergence suggests this split occurred somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 years ago, implying that clothing use of some consistent kind was established well before the peak cold of the last glacial maximum, which makes considerable sense, because by the time Homo sapiens was pushing into the colder environments of northern Eurasia, following mammoth herds onto the open steppe, crossing elevated terrain, surviving winters that would be considered extreme by contemporary standards in most inhabited regions today, the clothing they were wearing had clearly evolved well beyond simple hide wrapping. The archaeological evidence from sites across Siberia, Eastern Europe, and the Arctic regions suggests a sophisticated textile tradition involving not just the preparation of hides, but their cutting, shaping, and assembly into fitted, multi-piece garments. Using bone needles of impressive fineness and sinew, or plant fiber thread, the bone needles deserve particular appreciation. The earliest convincing examples, found at sites in Siberia, date to roughly 50,000 years ago, with some researchers arguing for even earlier examples at other locations. These are not crude punching tools. They are slender, carefully shaped, with eyes, holes through which thread passes, that required precise, controlled drilling of hard bone material using fine stone points. Producing a functional sewing needle from bone using only stone tools represents a chain of technical knowledge and fine motor skill that is, by any honest assessment, impressive craftsmanship. Someone designed this tool. Someone figured out that a hole in a specific location allowed thread to pass through in a way that made stitching faster and more controlled. Someone taught that knowledge to someone else. Scientists still debate the precise timeline and geographic origin of fitted, tailored clothing versus simpler wrapped or tied hide coverings. The distinction matters because tailored clothing, with its shaped panels, its fitted seams, its layered construction, provides dramatically superior thermal protection compared to a hide simply draped and secured around the body. A tailored fur parka with a fitted hood, matched to a person's body dimensions, traps a layer of warm air close to the skin in a way that a loosely draped covering simply cannot replicate. Some researchers argue that the expansion of Homo sapiens into genuinely Arctic environments, the mammoth steppe of Siberia, and eventually the land bridge into the Americas, would have been physiologically impossible without this level of clothing sophistication, making tailored garment technology not a cultural luxury, but a survival prerequisite. The range of materials used extended beyond large mammal hides. Arctic hair fur, prized for its exceptional warmth-to-weight ratio, appears to have been used for inner layers against the skin. Waterfowl skins with feathers retained could provide insulation and water resistance. Plant fibers, where available, were twisted into cordage that served multiple functions, including the construction of bags, nets, and binding. Evidence for plant fiber use in clothing is fragmentary and preservation dependent, but impressions of woven plant material preserved in fired clay at European sites dating to around 27,000 years ago suggest that weaving technology is considerably older than the later Neolithic period with which it is most commonly associated in popular imagination. Footwear, similarly, appears earlier in the archaeological record than is sometimes assumed. Analysis of foot bones from Homo sapiens specimens dating to around 40,000 years ago shows a reduction in the robustness of the smaller toe bones compared to earlier populations, a change consistent with regular footwear use, since encased feet exercise the smaller toes less intensively than bare feet navigating uneven terrain. Direct evidence in the form of preserved shoes is rare, but examples dating to around 10,000 years ago have been found in remarkably good condition in dry cave environments, showing construction techniques, shaped soles, wrapped uppers, laced fastenings, of genuine sophistication. What all of this evidence collectively paints is a picture not of people simply wrapping themselves in whatever came to hand, but of a developed, technically sophisticated clothing tradition. A tradition with its own accumulated knowledge, its own teaching lineage, its own tools, and its own standards of quality. The Ice Age was not endured despite inadequate clothing. It was inhabited, and in some cases deliberately sought out, because the clothing technology existed to make it survivable, though it still would have been extremely cold. No amount of technical sophistication fully fixes that particular problem. At some point tonight, if something minor goes wrong with your body, a headache settling in behind your eyes, a scratch from something sharp, a muscle that has decided to register a formal complaint about the position you have been lying in, you have options. A cabinet somewhere in your home almost certainly contains analgesics, antiseptic, bandaging material, and probably several other things whose precise mechanisms of action you may not fully understand, but whose reliability you trust completely. The infrastructure of modern medicine surrounds you so thoroughly that its absence is essentially unimaginable in daily life. You do not think about it until you need it, and when you need it, it is there. Early humans had none of that infrastructure. What they had instead was something that is simultaneously more modest and more remarkable: a detailed, empirically developed, orally transmitted knowledge of the natural pharmacopoeia surrounding them, accumulated across generations of careful observation, experimentation, and the kind of learning that comes from paying very close attention to what happens when you apply one thing to another thing and watch the result. This was not folk superstition dressed up as medicine, though distinguishing between the two in the prehistoric record is genuinely difficult and a source of ongoing scholarly debate. Much of what early humans used to treat illness and injury turns out, on modern biochemical analysis, to contain compounds with genuine pharmacological activity. The willow bark that appears in various traditional healing traditions across multiple continents contains salicin, which the body metabolizes into salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. Yarrow, a plant with a remarkably wide geographic distribution, contains acetylene, which promotes blood clotting and has antimicrobial properties that make it genuinely useful as a wound treatment, which is consistent with its appearance in traditional wound care practices across an extraordinary range of cultures with no evident contact with one another. Certain molds growing on stored plant material, the same basic biological category as the mold from which penicillin was eventually derived, were apparently applied to wounds in some traditional contexts, though whether this reflected an understanding of their antibiotic action or simply a coincidental practice that worked is impossible to determine from the available evidence. The Neanderthal burial site at Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq produced one of the more evocative pieces of evidence in this area. Analysis of soil samples from around a burial dating to roughly 60,000 years ago revealed concentrations of pollen from several plant species, including ephedra, groundsel, and grape hyacinth. Some researchers interpreted this as evidence that flowers or medicinal plants were deliberately placed with the dead, which would imply both ritual behavior and plant knowledge of considerable sophistication. Other researchers have argued that the pollen concentrations could be explained by burrowing animals introducing plant material to the burial context, removing the need for any intentional human placement. Scientists still debate whether the Shanidar flower burial represents genuine evidence of Neanderthal plant knowledge and ritual practice, or an archaeological interpretation that has been romanticized beyond what the evidence actually supports. But move forward in time to anatomically modern humans, and the evidence for deliberate medicinal plant use becomes considerably harder to dismiss. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque that forms on teeth and preserves with remarkable fidelity across tens of thousands of years, has become one of the more exciting frontiers in prehistoric health research because it traps fragments of everything that passes through the mouth, including plant material. Analysis of calculus from Paleolithic human remains has identified specific plant compounds, including bitter-tasting substances with no obvious nutritional value, in patterns suggesting deliberate ingestion rather than accidental dietary inclusion. Why would you eat something that tastes unpleasant and provides no calories unless you had a reason related to its effects on your body? Wound care in the prehistoric world would have been a constant, practical concern, given the physical demands of daily life and the ever-present risk of injury from stone tools, animal encounters, and the general hazards of moving through uncontrolled terrain. Archaeological evidence of healed injuries in Paleolithic skeletal material, fractures that show clean healing, amputations that the individual survived long enough for the bone to partially remodel, injuries that would have required sustained care and immobilization to recover from, implies that early humans were providing each other with medical care sufficient to keep seriously injured group members alive through recovery periods that could extend for weeks or months. This is not self-evident. A fractured femur in the wild, without intervention, is a life-threatening injury. The fact that we find healed femur fractures in Paleolithic remains tells us that someone set that bone immobilized that limb, and fed that person while they could not move. The psychological dimensions of prehistoric medicine are harder to access from the archaeological record, but are not entirely invisible. The use of altered states of consciousness, achieved through specific plants, rhythmic movement, sleep deprivation, or extreme sensory conditions, appears in shamanic traditions across an enormous geographic and cultural range, suggesting deep roots that may extend into the Paleolithic. Whether these practices produced genuine therapeutic benefit through psychosomatic mechanisms, placebo effects, or the direct biochemical action of psychoactive compounds on specific conditions, or whether they were purely spiritual in intent with health benefits incidental, is a question that sits at the intersection of anthropology, neuroscience, and philosophy in ways that make clean answers elusive. What the totality of the evidence suggests is that early humans were not simply enduring illness and injury with stoic resignation, waiting for modern medicine to arrive and solve their problems. They were actively, intelligently, and in many cases effectively managing the health challenges of their world, using the resources available to them and the knowledge their traditions had accumulated, not always successfully, not with anything approaching the efficacy of modern interventions for serious conditions, but with a seriousness of intent and a depth of accumulated knowledge that deserves considerably more credit than the term primitive medicine typically implies. The truly surprising part is how much of what they knew still works. There is something almost incomprehensible about the scale of what early humans did when they began moving out of Africa. Not because it happened quickly, it did not. The dispersal of Homo sapiens across the globe unfolded across tens of thousands of years, generation by generation, in increments so small that no individual participant would have experienced it as migration in any sense they could have articulated. No single person woke up one morning and decided to walk to Australia. What happened instead was something quieter and more gradual, a slow, continuous pressure of population growth, resource competition, climatic opportunity, and the simple human tendency to explore what lies beyond the next ridge, the next river, the next season's horizon, multiplied across hundreds of generations. That tendency moved our species from a single point of origin to every habitable corner of the planet. The currently accepted scientific consensus places the origin of anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Africa, with fossil evidence from sites including Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, where remains dating to approximately 300,000 years ago pushed the known age of our species back significantly when they were described in 2017, and Homo kibish in Ethiopia, among others. From that African origin, the story of human dispersal is one of the most ambitious journeys in the history of life on Earth, achieved entirely on foot, across terrain that ranged from tropical forest to open desert to frozen tundra to the edges of continental shelves exposed by glacially lowered sea levels. The route, or routes, by which Homo sapiens first left Africa remain subjects of active research and genuine debate. The most widely discussed pathway runs through the Sinai Peninsula and into the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean corridor, which would have provided a relatively hospitable route into southwestern Asia during periods when climate conditions made the region more vegetated and water-rich than it is today. A southern route, crossing the mouth of the Red Sea at its narrowest point, a crossing of perhaps 20 kilometers or less during periods of lowered sea level, into the Arabian Peninsula and onward along the southern Asian coastline, has also gathered significant support. Some researchers argue for a single major dispersal event. Others see evidence for multiple waves of expansion at different times, with earlier populations potentially reaching parts of Asia before the main expansion event that eventually populated the rest of the world. The genetic evidence, which should in principle resolve some of these questions, has instead added additional layers of complexity by revealing interbreeding events with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other archaic human populations along the way. That interbreeding is worth pausing on because it fundamentally changes the simple narrative of a single species spreading across an empty world. When Homo sapiens moved into Eurasia, they encountered Neanderthals, a closely related but distinct human species that had been living in Europe and Western Asia for at least 400,000 years and had developed their own sophisticated adaptations to those environments. The interactions between these two groups were evidently complex, involving both conflict and cooperation, and apparently reproduction. Most people of non-African ancestry today carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, a genetic inheritance from interbreeding events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago and left permanent marks on the modern human genome. Some of those Neanderthal genetic variants appear to have been genuinely useful, conferring immune system adaptations relevant to pathogens present in Eurasian environments that African origin populations had not previously encountered. The movement into Australia, which required crossing open water, even during periods of lowest sea level, when the landmasses of Southeast Asia were more extensively connected, represents one of the most remarkable achievements of early human dispersal. The minimum water crossing required to reach Australia from the nearest point of the Asian continental shelf, even under the most favorable glacial sea level conditions, was approximately 90 kilometers. Crossing 90 kilometers of open ocean without a compass, without charts, and without any previous knowledge that land lay on the other side, required watercraft capable of sustained ocean travel, navigational ability sufficient to maintain directional orientation across multiple days of open water, and either extraordinary luck or a systematic understanding of oceanic indicators, wave patterns, wind direction, cloud formations over distant land, the behavior of birds that pointed toward an invisible destination. The fact that humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, and possibly considerably earlier, means that this capability existed at a time when most popular accounts of human prehistory have our ancestors still largely confined to continental land travel. Scientists still debate the exact timing and mechanism of the initial peopling of the Americas, which represents the final major chapter of the global dispersal story. The traditional model proposes migration from northeastern Asia across the Beringian land bridge, the broad grassy plain exposed between Siberia and Alaska during glacial periods of lowered sea level, followed by southward movement through an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets as they began retreating. But archaeological evidence from sites in South America, some of which appear to predate the opening of the ice-free corridor, has pushed researchers to consider alternative or additional routes, including a coastal kelp highway, movement by watercraft along the ice-free Pacific coastline that would have allowed rapid southward dispersal along a resource-rich marine environment. What all of these migration stories share is a quality that is easy to overlook when discussing them in terms of routes and timelines and genetic evidence. They were accomplished by people, specific, individual people with names we will never know, making daily decisions about which direction to move, where to camp, what to eat, how to cross the water ahead of them, people who were cold sometimes, and hungry sometimes, and afraid sometimes, and occasionally stood on the edge of a new landscape they had never seen before, and looked out at it with whatever prehistoric version of wonder and curiosity feels like. They kept walking anyway. Every single time they kept walking, on a clear night, far from any artificial light source. The sky overhead is not the faint, washed-out backdrop that most people in the modern world are accustomed to seeing. It is something else entirely, a dense, almost overwhelming field of light, with the Milky Way stretching across it as a visible, textured band of concentrated stars, so bright it casts a faint shadow on pale ground. The planets move against this background with a regularity that becomes obvious after a few nights of careful watching. The moon traces its cycle with a precision that allows accurate prediction after only a month of observation. The stars rise and set with a consistency so reliable that specific stars appearing on the horizon at specific times of year announce the coming of specific seasons, with the dependability of a very accurate, very ancient calendar for early humans living entirely outdoors, sleeping under this sky every clear night for their entire lives. The celestial environment was not an occasional spectacle, viewed through a bedroom window. It was a constant, familiar, deeply known presence, as much a part of the daily landscape as the terrain underfoot and the wind direction overhead. And like the terrain and the wind, it was read, carefully, systematically, and with practical consequence. The most immediately useful celestial knowledge for prehistoric people was navigational. The North Star, Polaris, sits almost directly above the Earth's geographic North Pole, making it the one point in the northern sky that does not appear to move as the Earth rotates. Any traveler who knows which star is Polaris can determine north with confidence on any clear night, providing a fixed directional reference that requires no instrument beyond open eyes and remembered knowledge. The Southern Cross performs an equivalent function for navigation in the Southern Hemisphere, its orientation relative to the South Celestial Pole, providing directional information that has been used by Southern Hemisphere peoples for millennia. How far back reliable stellar navigation extends into the prehistoric period is difficult to establish archaeologically, but the cognitive prerequisites, sustained observation, pattern recognition, the ability to apply remembered knowledge to novel navigational situations, were all demonstrably present in early Homo sapiens. Seasonal tracking through stellar observation was arguably even more critical to daily survival than navigation. The heliacal rising of specific stars, their first appearance on the eastern horizon just before dawn, after a period of invisibility, marks specific dates in the solar year with remarkable precision and was used by numerous ancient cultures as an agricultural and seasonal calendar. But the cognitive foundation of this practice, the careful long-term observation of stellar positions across the seasonal cycle, and the recognition that specific configurations correlate reliably with specific environmental conditions, almost certainly predates formal agriculture by an enormous margin. Hunter-gatherer groups whose survival depended on being in the right place at the right time to intercept migratory animals, harvest specific plant foods at peak nutritional value, or avoid dangerous seasonal conditions, would have had powerful practical incentives to develop and maintain detailed knowledge of celestial seasonal markers. The lunar cycle provided a shorter period temporal rhythm that was useful for different purposes. The approximately 29.5-day cycle of the moon, from new to full and back again, provided a natural unit of time measurement, longer than a day, but shorter than a year. The origin, ultimately, of the month. Evidence for lunar tracking in the archaeological record appears in some interpretations of marked bones and antler fragments from Paleolithic sites, where regularly spaced notch series have been interpreted as tally records of lunar phases. The most famous such example, the Yashango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, dating to around 20,000 years ago, shows a series of notch groupings that some researchers read as evidence of lunar cycle recording, while others argue the groupings reflect other counting or gaming purposes. Scientists still debate whether these objects represent genuine astronomical record-keeping or are being interpreted through a framework that finds patterns the original makers did not intend. What is not seriously debated is the sophistication of astronomical knowledge in cultures that post-date the period we have been discussing tonight, but whose knowledge systems likely have deep prehistoric roots. Indigenous astronomical traditions from Australia, the Americas, Africa, and Polynesia document stellar and planetary knowledge of extraordinary precision and depth, maintained entirely through oral tradition and practical application across generations. The Polynesian navigational tradition, which guided the settlement of the most remote islands in the Pacific, using stellar, wave, wind, and wildlife indicators without any written charts or instruments, represents perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of what human minds can achieve in astronomical knowledge when survival depends on it and oral transmission is scrupulously maintained across generations. The psychological relationship between early humans and the sky was not purely utilitarian, however. The same cave art traditions that depicted terrestrial animals with such observational care and emotional intensity also included what some researchers interpret as astronomical imagery, geometric patterns that may represent star clusters, lunar phases, or seasonal celestial events. The Pleiades star cluster, one of the most visually distinctive groupings in the night sky, and visible to the naked eye as a tight knot of 7 or more stars, depending on viewing conditions, appears in the mythology and cosmological traditions of cultures on every inhabited continent, suggesting that its significance may stretch back to a period before human populations were geographically separated, potentially into the Paleolithic. There is something quietly moving about that possibility, that the same cluster of stars that you could look up and find right now, if you went outside on a clear night and knew where to look, was being watched and wondered about and woven into stories by people sitting around fires 50,000 years ago, the sky connecting them to you across an unimaginable distance of time, unchanged, patient, still there. The stars do not care how long it has been. They simply keep appearing, season after season, exactly where the ancient knowledge said they would be, deep inside the cave system of Chauvet in southern France, in a chamber that had been sealed by a rockfall for roughly 20,000 years before its discovery in 1994. There is a panel of paintings that stops almost everyone who sees it, in person or in photograph, for a moment longer than they expected. The animals depicted there, cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses, mammoths, bears, horses, are rendered with an observational accuracy and a sense of movement and life that feels somehow immediately recognizable, not primitive, not tentative, confident. The artist or artists who made these images understood anatomy, understood the way weight shifts in a moving animal, understood how to suggest depth and mass on a flat stone surface, using nothing but ochre and charcoal and the natural contours of the rock itself. The oldest paintings in the cave have been dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, though some researchers argue for even earlier dates for certain sections. 36,000 years is a number that is easy to say and almost impossible to genuinely absorb. It is longer than all of recorded human history, multiplied by a factor of several. It reaches back past the agricultural revolution, past the first cities, past the invention of writing, past everything that typically gets called civilization, and lands in a world we have been exploring together all night. A world of open landscapes and moving herds and fire-lit camps and the enormous sky overhead. And in that world, someone went deep into a cave with a torch, mixed pigment from mineral sources, and painted something that would still communicate directly to human eyes tens of thousands of years later. That continuity of communication is not a small thing. It means something about what was happening inside the minds of these people that goes considerably beyond the question of physical survival. You do not paint a cave lion with that level of careful attention because you are merely documenting a threat. You paint it because it matters to you in some way that exceeds the purely practical, because you are thinking about it, dreaming about it, feeling something in relation to it that demands expression in a form that outlasts the moment of feeling, the emergence of symbolic behavior, art, personal ornamentation, ritual practice, the deliberate creation of objects and images that carry meaning beyond their physical form, is one of the most discussed and debated topics in paleoanthropology. For a long time, the conventional narrative placed a symbolic revolution at roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago in Europe, coinciding with the arrival of modern humans and the appearance of the spectacular cave art tradition. But evidence from African sites has progressively pushed the earliest known symbolic behaviors much further back. Ochre, the iron-rich mineral pigment used in painting and body decoration, shows evidence of deliberate processing at sites in South Africa dating to 100,000 years ago and possibly earlier. Perforated shell beads, apparently used as personal ornamentation, have been found at North African and Middle Eastern sites dating to around 130,000 years ago. Geometric engravings on ochre pieces from Blombos Cave in South Africa date to approximately 75,000 years ago. Scientists still debate whether these early examples of symbolic behavior represent isolated, independent experiments that did not persist, a symbolic false start, so to speak, or the deep roots of a continuous tradition of symbolic thought that eventually flowered into the full behavioral modernity visible in the European Upper Paleolithic. The distinction has profound implications for how we understand the cognitive evolution of our species, and the debate is far from resolved. What we can say with confidence is that by the period of the cave paintings, the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, between roughly 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, symbolic culture was flourishing in ways the archaeological record preserves with unusual richness. Cave paintings are the most dramatic evidence, but they are not the only one. Portable art objects, carved figurines of animals and humans, decorated tools, personal ornaments made from shells, teeth, ivory, and stone, appear across a wide geographic range. Musical instruments, including bone flutes with carefully drilled finger holes capable of producing specific pitches, date to at least 40,000 years ago. The Venus figurines, a series of carved female figures found across a broad swath of Europe and Western Asia, sharing certain stylistic features despite their geographic spread, suggest the existence of shared symbolic traditions spanning enormous distances and presumably maintained through social networks of contact and exchange. Burial practices reveal perhaps the most intimate dimension of the inner life of these early people. The deliberate burial of the dead, with grave goods, tools, ornaments, food items, pigment placed alongside the body, implies beliefs about death and what follows it that we cannot directly access but can recognize as meaningful. Someone placed a child's body in the ground with strings of shells and ivory beads 30,000 years ago and covered it carefully. That act contains within it a relationship to loss, to memory, to the meaning of a life that feels immediately comprehensible across the entire distance of time, separating that moment from this one. Music deserves its own moment here, because it is easy to underestimate how ancient and how central it likely was to early human social life. Rhythm, in particular, the coordinated beating of time by a group, produces measurable physiological effects, including the synchronization of heartbeats and breathing among participants, the release of endorphins, and a sense of social bonding and collective identity that has been described across cultures as a nearly universal feature of group musical experience. In a social world where group cohesion was a survival variable, these effects were not incidental. They were functional. Music may have been one of the technologies of social bonding, as practically important to group survival in its way as fire or stone tools, though admittedly somewhat harder to use as a weapon. Every toolkit has its limitations. There is a question that sits quietly beneath everything we have explored tonight, one that becomes more pressing the more you consider how much knowledge early humans carried with them through their world. All of it, every tracking skill, every plant identification, every fire-making technique, every navigational star, every medicinal application, every tool-napping tradition, every social norm, every story, every song, existed nowhere except inside human minds. There were no books, there were no scrolls, there were no clay tablets, no knotted cords, no carved calendars reliable enough to carry the full weight of everything a group needed to know to survive. The entire accumulated knowledge base of a human community lived, breathed, and died with the people who held it, which means that the transmission of that knowledge from the people who had it to the people who needed to acquire it was not a secondary concern sitting alongside the practical business of survival. It was itself one of the most critical survival activities the group engaged in. Every single day, understanding how that transmission worked requires thinking carefully about the structure of early human groups and the roles different people within them played. Children in hunter-gatherer societies did not experience childhood the way children in modern industrial societies typically do, as a protected period of guided development, largely separated from the serious work of adult life, structured around formal educational institutions and age-segregated peer groups. Instead, children moved through the world alongside adults from very early ages, present at and gradually participating in the full range of activities that constituted daily life. A child of 6 or 7 would already be accompanying foraging trips, learning to identify plants by sight, smell, and texture, practicing the fine motor skills involved in tool use, and absorbing the navigational and environmental knowledge that adults demonstrated through action rather than explicit instruction. This learning by presence model is considerably more effective for certain kinds of knowledge than formal instruction, and developmental research supports this intuition. Skills that are primarily procedural, that live in the body rather than the verbal mind, that are built from thousands of small calibrations across repeated practice, are learned most efficiently through observation and imitation, with correction and guidance provided in the moment of practice, rather than abstracted into verbal rules delivered in a classroom context. Napping a stone tool, preparing a hide, constructing a shelter, reading animal tracks. These are all skills of this type. Watching an expert and then doing it yourself, badly at first, then less badly, then adequately, then well, is how the body learns things that the verbal mind cannot fully encode. But not all knowledge transmits through observation alone. Complex ecological knowledge, the seasonal patterns of animal migration, the multi-year fluctuations in plant productivity, the rare but critical information about extreme events like floods or droughts or unusual predator behavior, requires language. It requires the ability to describe things that are not currently visible, to talk about what happened 3 winters ago and what that implies for this winter, to pass on information about places the listener has never been and may someday need to find. This is where storytelling becomes not an entertainment technology, but an information storage and retrieval system of the highest practical importance. The stories told around prehistoric fires were not merely pleasant diversions from the serious business of survival. They were, in many cases, the serious business of survival, encoded in narrative form because narrative is how human memory works most reliably. Information embedded in a compelling story, with characters, causation, emotional stakes, and memorable imagery, is retained and recalled with dramatically greater fidelity than equivalent information presented as a list of facts. The story of the time the hunting party followed the wrong river and nearly died of thirst before finding water 2 days east of the dry ridge contains within it a navigational lesson, a warning about specific terrain features, and a set of emergency decision-making principles that could save a life decades after the original event in the hands of someone who was not yet born when it happened. Elders occupied a specific and genuinely irreplaceable role in this knowledge ecosystem. In a world without external storage of any kind, the oldest surviving members of a group were the living libraries of everything the group had collectively experienced across the longest available time span. A 70-year-old elder in a hunter-gatherer band has witnessed 70 years of seasonal variation, animal behavior, climate fluctuation, social conflict, and environmental change that no younger person in the group has access to except through that elder's memory and willingness to share it. Crucially, they have also witnessed the rare events, the once-in-a-generation drought, the unusual predator incursion, the catastrophic flood, that younger people have no direct experience with, but will need to respond to when those events recur. Scientists still debate the relative importance of vertical knowledge transmission from elders to younger generations versus horizontal transmission between peers of similar age and experience in shaping the evolution of human cultural complexity. Some models emphasize the critical importance of high-fidelity vertical transmission from skilled elders as the mechanism that allows cumulative cultural evolution, the ratchet-like accumulation of knowledge and technique across generations that eventually produces the extraordinary sophistication of human material culture. Others point to the creative, innovative potential of horizontal peer transmission, in which new ideas spread rapidly through social networks of similarly aged individuals, experimenting and sharing simultaneously. The balance between these modes of transmission and how it shifted across different periods and environments of human prehistory remains an active area of research. What is clear is that children and elders were not peripheral figures in prehistoric social life, tolerated at the margins of a world dominated by productive age adults. They were integral to the functioning of the knowledge system that made everything else possible. The child learning to read tracks beside an experienced hunter, the elder describing a distant water source remembered from a journey made 40 years prior, the adolescent practicing fire making under patient guidance, failing repeatedly, being shown again, trying once more. These moments of knowledge transfer were as essential to group survival as any hunt, any shelter construction, any medicinal treatment. Education, in other words, is not a modern invention. It is as old as the knowledge worth passing on. And that knowledge was, as we have spent tonight discovering together, considerably older and richer than most of us were ever taught to imagine. We have traveled a considerable distance tonight, from the open grasslands where early humans first developed their extraordinary endurance bodies, through the firelit camps where knowledge was stored in story and song, across frozen plains where mammoth bone shelters held families through glacial winters, and out across the ocean horizons that the first Australians crossed in boats whose design we can only imagine. We have watched people read landscapes like open books, treat wounds with the pharmacopoeia growing at their feet, sew fitted garments from the hides of animals they hunted with coordinated intelligence, and paint cave walls with a confidence and skill that still stops modern viewers cold. We have spent the night with people who, by every meaningful measure, were fully, completely, recognizably human. And now, in this final section, it is worth sitting quietly with a question that the entire evening has been building toward, without quite stating directly. How did all of that, the tools, the fire, the clothing, the medicine, the art, the social structures, the navigational knowledge, the stories, how did all of that become the world you are lying in right now? The answer is not a dramatic one. It does not arrive in a single moment of invention or a sudden civilizational leap. It arrives, instead, the way almost everything important arrives, gradually, cumulatively, almost invisibly, through the accumulation of small improvements made by individual people in specific moments, each building on what the person before them had worked out, each passing their refinement forward into a future they could not see or imagine. Consider the stone tool. The earliest recognized stone tools, belonging to the Oldowan tradition and made by pre-sapiens hominins, are simple, sharp-edged flakes struck from a core, useful, genuinely, but limited. Across hundreds of thousands of years, tool-making traditions evolved. The more carefully shaped hand axes of the Apulian tradition, then the prepared core techniques of the Mousterian, then the blade technologies of the Upper Paleolithic that produced long, thin, standardized cutting edges from a single carefully prepared core with a efficiency and consistency that the earlier traditions could not approach. Each step in this progression was a genuine innovation, a worked-out improvement over what existed before. But no single step looks, in isolation, like a revolution. Each looks like a modest refinement. The revolution is only visible when you step back and look at the full trajectory across deep time. This is the essential character of what some researchers call cumulative cultural evolution, the process by which human culture accumulates improvements across generations at a rate and to a degree of complexity that no other species approaches. The critical ingredient is not individual genius, though individual innovation certainly plays a role. The critical ingredient is faithful transmission, the ability to pass on what you have learned with sufficient accuracy that the next generation can start from where you ended, rather than having to rediscover everything from the beginning. A chimpanzee that discovers a useful technique will use it for its lifetime. The technique may spread to group mates through observation, but it rarely persists and almost never builds. Human cultural traditions, by contrast, can compound across hundreds of generations. each adding its small increment until the accumulated result bears no visible resemblance to its origin. The transition from the Paleolithic world we have been exploring tonight to the Neolithic, the period beginning roughly 12,000 years ago, when agriculture and settled village life began to emerge in several locations around the world, was not a sudden replacement of one way of life by a clearly superior alternative. It was a gradual, partial, geographically uneven shift, driven by a complex combination of climatic change, population pressure, and the incremental development of plant and animal management practices that may have begun as minor modifications of existing foraging behaviors before eventually becoming the foundation of something recognizably different. The people who first began deliberately cultivating plant stands, saving seeds, managing animal herds, and settling in one place long enough to build structures intended to last more than a season, were not aware they were inventing agriculture. They were making practical decisions in response to immediate circumstances, using knowledge and techniques developed over thousands of years of intensive engagement with the plants and animals around them. The revolution, again, is only visible in retrospect, at a distance of time that none of its participants could have imagined occupying. Scientists still debate the relative roles of environmental pressure, specifically the dramatic climate shifts at the end of the Pleistocene, which transformed vegetation patterns across much of the world and may have made certain plant management strategies newly advantageous versus social and demographic factors in driving the transition to agriculture in its multiple independent global origins. The fact that agriculture appears to have developed independently in at least 7 or 8 different locations around the world within a relatively narrow window of time suggests that whatever triggered it was global in nature, most likely climate-driven, rather than a single cultural invention that spread outward from a single origin point. But here is what I want you to carry with you as tonight's journey closes. Every piece of infrastructure surrounding you, right now, the walls, the roof, the bed, the electricity, the heating, the materials, the accumulated knowledge encoded in every object in your home, is the distant descendant of decisions made by people who had none of it, who sat in the dark beside fires they had learned to make, in shelters they had learned to build, wearing clothing they had learned to sew, eating food they had learned to find and prepare, telling stories that carried everything they knew forward into a future they could not see. They had no idea where it was all going. They were simply doing, as well as they could, what the day required. Surviving, learning, passing it on, surviving again. And now, as the last of tonight's fire burns low, let the story settle around you like warmth. Outside, the world continues its ancient rhythms, wind moving through trees that have no memory of the ice that once covered them, stars rising on the same patient schedule they kept above every camp and cave and mammoth bone shelter that ever housed a human life. The night is very old. You are part of something very long. Let your breathing slow. Now, there is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to figure out before morning. The people we spent tonight walking with survived everything the Pleistocene could offer them. The cold, the predators, the long, hungry winters, the distances that would break a modern body to contemplate. They did it with their minds and their hands, and each other, and they left you, across an unbroken chain of lives, stretching back through the dark of deep time, exactly where you are right now, warm, sheltered, fed, safe in the dark. Let the images from tonight drift gently. The mammoth herds moving across frozen ground, the handprint pressed against cave stone, the needle pulling sinew through a hide seam, the fire circle reflected in patient, watching eyes. Let them soften and blur at the edges the way images do when sleep begins to pull them gently inward. There is no need to hold on to any of it. It is already part of you, already written somewhere older than memory, in the body that carried you through today, the same way it carried them through all those thousands of yesterday. The stars outside are the same stars. The dark is the same dark. And you, lying there in it, are the latest chapter of the longest story ever told. Rest now. You have earned it, simply by being here, simply by being the living proof that all of that survival, all of that learning, all of that quiet, stubborn, extraordinary persistence worked. It worked. Sweet dreams.